If you don't know the notes on the guitar fretboard, it's going to be almost impossible for you to do this. In this video, I'll be addressing some responses to another video that I made a couple of months ago called Why Don't Guitarists Know the Fretboard? And the primary pushback that I got from some other people in that video, which was kind of talking about how unfortunately guitar has this unique situation where a lot of players don't actually know the notes that they're playing for different reasons, like learning from tabs and just the fact that the guitar is such a visual instrument. And some people said, well, it's not all that important for you to know the notes on the guitar fretboard. What's a lot more important is knowing intervals and interval shapes. Now, actually, I do agree with that to a certain extent. I think that a lot of times knowing intervals can actually be a bit more useful and easier to think of in certain situations than knowing the notes, but I don't think that that's some kind of substitution. Like if you're really familiar with intervals, now you don't really need to know the notes or know the different notes that go into different keys, and I'm going to show you exactly why. The main reason you really should know the actual notes on the fretboard as opposed to only memorizing intervals is that it's going to be almost impossible for you to do what I did in the beginning of the video, which is play a lick that has a very wide interval in the middle of it. Now, let's go over to the computer really quick so I can show you in a little bit more detail what I'm talking about. So in that lick in the beginning of the video, I said that I started on this low G. I played some stuff in the G minor pentatonic scale, which would be some of these notes here. And I actually eventually skipped all the way up to this F note here. So the problem with this is that if we look at this interval, let's just take all these other notes. This interval is actually technically a minor 21st interval. Now I know that sounds crazy, and it is kind of crazy because I wouldn't actually ever really think of it as a minor 21st interval. So the way that people usually practice intervals, and this is the way that makes the most sense, is to start with what's called simple intervals. And simple intervals are any interval basically an octave or less. So from this G to this G, that would be an octave, and any interval that is smaller than that interval. So for example, the closest G to F we would find going up would be this F, and that would actually be a minor 7th interval. So usually when I'm thinking of going from G to F, I'm just thinking of minor 7th intervals. But if you actually check this out on the guitar, this is a pretty easy interval to visualize. Why? Because it's right there. You have G, and then on the same fret, you have an F note, which is your minor 7th. Same thing with other intervals, like G to D. This is a really easy interval shape to visualize. This is a perfect fifth, G to D. And then no matter where you are on the guitar fretboard, it's pretty easy to visualize another perfect fifth, like C to G. That would also be another perfect fifth. It's always going to be the same shape, where you have a note here, and then you go over a string and down 2 frets. But this kind of strategy doesn't really work for bigger intervals. So the next most common interval that people practice are what's called compound intervals. So anything that's over an octave. So for example, G to A, this A here. This would be a major 9th interval. That would be sort of like G to this A here, except that now we get rid of this A and move it up an octave. So there's a couple of different ways we could play this major 9th interval. We could have this one where we go over 2 strings and then go back a fret from our starting note. Or you have this major 9th, which is we go over 2 strings and then all the way 4 frets over. So this is also a major 9th, G to A. And at this point, we can still kind of see these interval shapes. They're not too bad for us to visualize. Even something like tenths, which is the same thing as a major third. So G to B would be our simple interval major third. But if we want to go G to B an octave higher, like this, that would be a major tenth. This is still not too bad to visualize. Basically, even anything that's going from here to, let's say here, this is actually 2 octaves apart, G to G to G. That would be 2 octaves. So once we start getting here, though, if we want to get a wider interval than this 2 octaves, we have to start going right on the fretboard. So when we start going all the way to here, for example, let's say if I wanted to play G to D, but I wanted to do not just this G to D and not even this one, which is an octave higher. This would be a perfect 12th. Then if I wanted to go all the way up another octave, G to this D here, now we're starting to see, I dare you to try it. You're not really going to be able to see this pattern because there's too much stuff in between. There's like too much gray area in between here to be able to visualize this pattern. Now, if you know all the different scale notes that are in between this original G note and that D note, then it's not going to be too bad for you to do it. But it's going to be much easier if you just think, wait a second, okay, I know that in the key of G minor, or G minor pentatonic in this case, I have a D note, and you know that this is a D note over here, that I can just be playing stuff in my G minor pentatonic scale, and whenever I want, I can just jump all the way up to this D note. And in the example I played in the beginning of the video, again, we had going from this G all the way up to this F, which, like I said, would be a minor 21st. So it's like our minor 7th, but here's our minor 7th. Then we add another octave. This would be a minor 14th. Again, this is starting to get a little bit tricky, right? We're going over 1, 2, 3, 4 strings and then over 3 frets. But now, once we get this far, the interval shapes just really aren't going to cut it. At that point, you just have to know, hang on a second, I have this F note here, and I can jump all the way from playing stuff down here, all the way up there, and then be able to jump back down to whatever, this D note here, or this F note here, or this D note, or this G note. So that's kind of the idea that I wanted to explain to you in this video, that you really need to be familiar with the actual notes on the fretboard, because it just doesn't work when you have these huge intervals for you to be thinking of the literal interval, a 21st. I mean, that's just ridiculous. I have never thought of that in my entire life when I've been practicing, actually. The only reason I've been able to play material like this is because, again, I know the notes that are in the G minor scale or G minor pentatonic scale, whatever it is, and I know that, hey, I have some of these notes up here that I can access. Of course, there's other notes around this. For example, you have like this D note, this G note here, and I know that if I'm playing here in my normal sort of box pattern, I can at any time just jump up here and now grab one of these notes that I know is part of that set of notes, that scale. It's not just some kind of random pattern that I'm memorizing that's based off of visuals. And I have all these other notes that are around there. So it allows you to really quickly and freely get around the fretboard, and it's super important for you to really know the notes of the fretboard and know the notes that are in every key that you play. So if you want to learn the fretboard for real and get true freedom in your playing, then go to Jamsville.com and subscribe to this channel right now.